This will be a presentation on metaethics, and this should pretty much complete what we've been discussing this semester. What is metaethics, in particular the relationship between it and the fact-value problem? Well, metaethics is basically that subject area of philosophy in which we, in essence, philosophize and engage in critical thinking about the subject matter of ethics. We also, as you probably have noticed, spend some time analyzing the terminology utilized in ethical discourse, and we also make an attempt to try to understand the various structures of ethical theory. So this presentation will in essence be about not only the fact-value issue, but also how it is that we are able to apply philosophical insights to an understanding of what ethical theory is and what it prescribes, and also how to utilize it in order to make successful ethical decisions. Let's start with the concept of naturalism. Now again, from a meta-ethical point of view, what we attempt to do is try to provide a categorical framework within which we can understand the various manifestations of the theories that we have been discussing and reading about. Naturalism is the theory that value statements can be defined in terms of factual statements. Let's take a look at what a fact is. Generally, we mean by the term fact that which is signified by empirically verifiable statements. Those statements are things such as Saturn has 12 moons. Now, it may be that Saturn has many more moons than that, NASA has come to discover, and it may be that the statement that it has only 12 moons is erroneous, but it is still a factual statement, largely because of the fact that we are in a position to be able to verify it as being either true or false. But a fact generally implies that whatever it is, whatever statement that is looked upon as a fact is a true statement. In contrast, a value is that which is signified by the human evaluation of a sentence. Remember, it is at least sentient beings like human beings that are able to attribute a value to the external world, to events, to objects, and to activities. It's not clear that other creatures in the animal kingdom, aside from human beings, can do that. Perhaps they can. The implication would be that there must be something in our phenotypic or genotypic makeup that empowers us to have the attributes necessary, the characteristics and features required for attributing value to something in the world or in ourselves. Still, a fact is something that's out there, as it were, in the world, and it's up to us to empirically discover those. Values, it's not clear, are in the world. However, naturalism wants to hold that we can probably define value statements in terms of factual statements. So you see, this is where we begin the is-ought distinction. The problem is, can you actually derive an ought, so to speak, which would be a value-type statement, from an is, which would be a factual-type statement? How is that done? In contrast with naturalism, the view of non-naturalism is that moral facts exist but are not natural. There's such a thing as moral facts, but they're not in the natural world. We discover them, if we discover them at all, presumably by our human intuition. And it ends up being the case that the task for philosophers is to define the terms used and the source of the definition of the terms in philosophizing. If you want to try to unpack the idea that is latent clearly in non-naturalism, that we intuit moral facts, you probably end up with a variety of criticisms and critiques, one of which stems from the very notion of intuition. What is that? What does it mean to intuit something? Well, the idea would be that while you might not be able to actually point to something out there in the universe or in the world at large, in nature or elsewhere, that is itself a moral issue, empirically, so to speak, nevertheless, something in your human intuition allows you to be able to pick out some feature of that world out there objectively and realize that it is a value statement or at least a concern with moral value. Let's take a look at the concept of Emotivism, which was popular early in the 20th century. This is a theory that holds that moral judgments don't have truth values at all. So if you take a look at the notion of metaethics that we've mentioned previously as the presentation began, We're taking a look at various kinds of approaches to ethics, naturalism, non-naturalism, and now emotivism. These are frameworks or paradigm structures in which we navigate, presumably, to moral conclusions based upon certain presuppositions or assumptions that are made within that framework. So, this theory assumes that moral judgments don't have truth values. You cannot say that this is good is in fact true. If anything, moral judgments are expressions of our attitudes only. So if we have a particular kind of an attitude or feeling towards something, what emotivism says is that that's really what constitutes the moral value of an act or an assertion or a state of affairs, supposedly. It's our, if you will, sentient response. Not necessarily an intellectual one, but just based on the way in which we feel or are constructed or have been raised to react. These judgments express our feelings and help us to persuade others to act as we desire. So the idea would be that, if you find something that you approve of has moral approbation for you, you speak up in its behalf and you attempt to persuade people. So if you've taken a course in persuasive speech, it might be that as a motivist, you would be able to choose a language and a concept that would enable you to get to that point where you would persuade other people that your moral judgment is the one that is more worthy of believing. But the problem, of course, for logicians and philosophers is that it seems like what this ends up doing is boiling down to whose feelings are the strongest or expressed the most strongly. Is there some room for rational judgment? A Kantian and a deontologist, of course, would have some real difficulty with this notion of emotivism. Intuitionism is the ethical theory that the good or right thing to do can be known directly via intuition. And the most prominent proponent of that view was Mr. G.E. Moore in the early part of the 20th century. And one of the things that he's known for is the claim that a concept like good is really unanalyzable. It's unanalyzable in any sense in which you'd analyze terms that are in a typically factually oriented statement. It's just there. You intuit it. You just know what is good. Now think about it. Maybe that sounds intuitively, so to speak, good to you, to hear somebody actually come forth and say something like that. And it is a theory against which others are competing. But what I want you to do always in all of this is realize that I'm simply in a mode of presenting some of this information, and what I'd like you to do is to consider what the critiques and the analyses would be of various of the claims that are made by philosophers in certain of these traditions. A little bit further on Mr. Moore's Intuitionism, there is the Humean thesis. This comes from the philosopher David Hume. Ought statements cannot be derived from is statements. That is to say, you cannot derive an ought from an is. There is the Platonic thesis, which we basically have given a synoptic view of previously. Basic value terms refer to non-natural properties. So, this domain of value and morality is in a sphere which is distinct from the natural world on the intuitionist's thesis. So it then would seem that it's primarily entities like human beings that impart value to the world, and if it weren't for them, it might turn out to be the case that there was no real value to be held. However, it is true that Mr. Moore does believe that if you were to compare and contrast two very different, let us say, naturally occurring environments, one having a lot of garbage, detritus, and debris, the other consisting principally of pure streams, fresh air, and pine trees, and all of the nice things we associate with the wild, Moore himself would say, well, it's just obvious, isn't it, that you would be able to intuit that the pristine nature area is far superior to the one that's ridden with debris. You have to ask yourself the question, do I believe in that? Does that make good sense? How is it that I'd be able to convey that quote-unquote truth to someone? In addition to these two components, getting back to Mr. Moore's Intuitionism, the cognitive notion, moral statements are either true or false, and that they can be known, and the intuition thesis, moral truths are discovered by intuition and are self-evident upon reflection. So, from these basic, not too terribly humble origins comes the Moorean intuitionism notion, that you would be able to find moral truth, but that would be principally due to your intuition and not to any empirical undertaking. You would, upon reflection, just see that the natural stream and the wonderful wilderness is just a beautiful thing and good in and of itself by simply meditating. And perhaps it's something like the Intuitionist thesis, although I think it probably has other ramifications, that may be operating in some environmental orientation, such as that of Henry David Thoreau in Walden Pond, for example, and also John Muir. And I personally tend to be somewhat impressed by those two, not too terribly different orientations. But it does seem like they are intuitionists at the very least, in the sense in which either Thoreau or Muir would just simply look at a waterfall, some beautiful place in Walden Pond, or some area perhaps up in Hetch Hetchy before it was inundated, or in beautiful Yosemite, and note that it's just good, and it somehow has some moral value inherent in it. And that would seem to be Moore's idea of intuitionism. You just see it. It's kind of hard to express it, but upon reflection, you just see that something like that is good or not. This brings us to the idea of prescriptivism in the meta-ethical domain. Value judgments don't have truth values. They're more than mere expressions of attitudes. In other words, unlike emotivism, prescriptivism says that while they don't have truth values, they're not just the expression of our personal attitudes. Moral judgments then become universal prescriptions. What does that mean? That means that if you make a moral judgment, you come to terms with a judgment that you believe, or principle that you believe, let us say, ought to be universalized, then it becomes something that you can prescribe to other people to follow. And that seems to be precisely the situation, incidentally, that we have with somebody like Mr. Kant, Immanuel Kant, with deontology. Deontological categorical imperatives are prescriptions for action. Very similar to the Golden Rule, once again, and perhaps all of this is just a verbose way it ends up of trying to justify rationally or get a different sort of handle on the notion of the Golden Rule. And of course, moral judgments then are given to guide actions. Another concept that's mentioned in your book that I think it's appropriate for us to kind of delve into just a little bit, and that's called supervenience. This is a dependency relationship between properties or facts of one type with properties or facts of another type. And in metaethics, supervenience is the idea that moral properties supervene or emerge out of natural ones. So while the somewhat wordy way of putting it might be a little bit off-putting, supervenience is merely another way of suggesting that things emerge. Almost in another language, as epiphenomena. You have a collection, let us say, of acts or events, or perhaps even some naturally occurring situation out there in the world, and when everything comes together, what happens is that there's something that emerges from it. So, in a sense, the word I suppose that many people are using these days to try to describe supervenience would be synergy. Another way might be putting it is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. If you put a lot of naturally occurring things like waterfalls, rocks, and trees together, somehow out of it comes something that is of value, that if you were to analyze and divide it all up into its parts, you wouldn't see any of the value there. But as everything synergizes and comes together, the whole is something which expresses the supervening or emerging of value out of that collection of things. A very straightforward example would be something like the notion of badness comes out of pain, which certainly a utilitarian would probably think is the correct attitude to take. Goodness comes out of happiness. So if you have a state of happiness, the idea is that goodness supervenes, and that's where there is a kind of a tie-up between the concepts of happiness on the one hand and moral goodness on the other. Remember, John Stuart Mill talks somewhat that way in places, that it's just understood, isn't it, that happiness is a good, is something good. Aristotle, happiness would for Aristotle be an inherent good. We do things, all of the things we do, presumably on account of happiness. So it might be said that at the end of an Aristotelian type life, goodness supervenes or emerges from the state of being happy. And remember, the Greek word for that was eudaimonia. In a good ethical theory, what we want is universalizability. And again, getting back to where we started, metaethics is about trying to categorize various theories and moral phenomena, if you will. And one of the things that a theory should be is universalizable, and the principle that expresses that says that if some act is wrong or right for one person in a situation, then it would be wrong or right for any relevantly similar person in that kind of a situation. It's also a principle of consistency that aims to eliminate irrelevant considerations from ethical assessments. So what we're looking for here is a degree to which, a la, really, Mr. Immanuel Kant, when you think about it, moral principles, statements, judgments, and theories can be universalized. They can apply to everybody, or at least ought to apply to everybody, given the circumstances that have been picked out. So, again, what is right in one particular circumstance for a person, on the assumption that none of us are morally better or worse than any of the rest of us at birth, then it should be right or wrong for somebody else in a similar circumstance. In ethics, principles, of course, are central to moral reasoning. They serve as major premises in our moral arguments, and we have spoken a little bit about constructing arguments in order to generate and prove a point, substantiate a point. If it is a moral argument and you end up in a conclusion with some ought statement or some moral thing that you believe people should adhere to or do, then one of the premises has to be a moral premise. So if you make a moral argument and you're using presumably deductive argumentation and inferencing, or inductive inferencing, using a little bit of critical thinking, then you may have some facts and observations, and I want you to think a little bit about the chart that I passed out and also the PowerPoint that we discussed previously about how to make a moral decision. You have to put things together like obligations, duties, principles, facts, observations, and that's really what's being said here. But what we're focusing now on here is that in a good moral theory, the kinds of principles that emerge from that theory serve as premises in an argument, where the argument concludes in something that you should or should not do. Certainly we acquire or learn basic set of principles. Maybe some people would argue that we're born with them. That might be questionable, but there is a degree to which we acquire or learn them and begin to discover them as we become more mature and autonomous. And we learn when to use or when to subordinate those principles given the circumstances, and we choose when, where, and why to apply our specific principles. So if you kind of put all this together, and you're being rather rational about the process by means of which you arrive at a moral decision, then you're going to be triaging various principles, various statements, various observations, in order to try to generate the conclusion which you can live with.